What steers an ordinary man towards an extraordinary destiny? Lost and morose on this cliff in Brittany, he gazes into the distance, as if desperately trying to rediscover the distant past, a time before lost innocence and bitter disillusionment. At first glance, Bernard Boursicot seems much the same as any other solitary walker, except that youth and naivete led Bernard to become a spy in the service of Communist China. A berobed opera singer entered his life, and his ensuing passion, loaded with secrets, is at the center of this unbelievable tale. In 1949, China was waking up to communism. Mao Zedong's Long March carried the hopes of millions of workers and peasants. His People's Republic succeeded thousands of years of dynastic imperialism. Rejecting the directives of the Big Brother Soviet Empire, Mao imposed his own model. From then on, China lived as a recluse behind walls, locked away, inaccessible and impenetrable. 15 years later, the Cold War polarized the world's two superpowers, posing a grave threat to world peace. It was against this backdrop that General de Gaulle made an important decision. As a staunch defender of France's independence within the Western Bloc, he sought to demonstrate his fierce opposition to the Kremlin's domination of Peking. On January 27, 1964, he duly restored diplomatic relations with Communist China.
After my stroke, I returned to Shanghai 3 years ago. I left all my things here with a cousin to keep it in the family. It's all China, China, China. This is a big Chinese flag from Mao Zedong's tomb. Here's a photo of me when I was 20 in China, enjoying a new lease of life in a country where everything seemed exotic to me. And we're all foreigners, felt like Marco Polo. There was always something new to discover that no one else had seen before.
There was nothing to suggest that Bernard Boursicot was following in the footsteps of Marco Polo. Far from any historical upheavals, the young Bernard Boursicot dreamed only of movies, art, and travel. He dreamed of going to the Amazon. Back home in Brittany, in his hard-working childhood amid the chills of Morbihan, he was sure of only one thing, that his future lay elsewhere, far from the rainy Sunday mornings on market stalls with his father and his modest job as an accountant's assistant in Vannes. In 1964, at the age of 20, he left for Paris to satisfy his craving for culture. Mingling with the film community, he met the founder of the Cinémathèque Française, Henri Langlois, and his companion Mary Meerson. Through them, he heard about the embassy that France was planning to open in Peking. The news brought hope, a belief that his dream was not completely out of reach. In fact, it was so close that it made him tremble with impatience.
They said, "We're in a hurry. We need an accountant right away. Do you want the job?" I didn't give it a second thought. Yes, of course. Then at the last moment, they said, "It's off. You're not going to China. We hear that you're under 18. We need your parents' permission."
A month after arriving in Paris, Bernard Boursicot flew off to Peking. One can easily imagine the thrill and enthusiasm that must have pervaded the mind of a lad from Brittany, plunged almost incidentally into the flux of history in the making. Claude Chaillet, France's first representative in Peking in 1964, could see that within, this totally inexperienced young man was burning with curiosity.
Bernard Boursicot was a provincial, launched like a bomb onto another planet, which in this case was China, the China of Mao Zedong. And so he came out from Nantes, if I'm not mistaken, launched like a missile from Nantes to Peking. It was obvious what an extraordinary character he was, this newcomer to China, who was now part of an embassy, and all the glamour that goes with it. So it goes without saying that he must have felt rather lonely and probably a little disoriented.
On October 25, 1964, I arrived in Peking, take up a post as an accountant in the French embassy. It was autumn in China, beautiful and poetic, and very rural. The road took us through the countryside as soon as we left the airport, right up to the diplomatic quarter. And I could see the Chinese, all seemingly calm and pleasant. At that time, the Chinese all dressed the same way, in the uniform of Mao. All the leaders dressed the same way, both men and women, wearing tunics. The tunics were unisex and identical, and very clever too, making the sexes indistinguishable.
Unlike the French diplomatic upper classes, who lived in splendid isolation, this young man never grew tired of discovering China, endlessly fascinated by the working class he was a child of, and which in this land had seized power. Bernard and his friend Patrice Favre, a young researcher at the embassy, couldn't wait to get on their bicycles to roam the back streets of Peking, plunging themselves into the mysteries of the Orient.
Everybody was dressed the same way, although obviously I never mixed up the men and the women. On the other hand, I had long hair, and I often heard Chinese look at me and say, "Is it a man or is it a woman?" It's a stupid question, but nobody had long hair. It was unthinkable for a Chinese to have long hair. So that's how it was. Anyway, we were Martians to the Chinese. For the most part, no Chinese had ever seen a foreigner in the flesh. So wherever we went, we were the objects of great curiosity.
It was like I was on another planet.
He first set eyes on her one evening at a reception in the French embassy. While the society crowd tried to outdo one another with their elegance and diplomatic bows, Bernard was introduced to a mysterious figure by the name of Xi Peipu. Bernard was instantly fascinated by this timeless creature, transformed into a princess by a lead pencil and a puff of face powder. Faced with this oriental siren who seemed to be from another world, another era, Boursicot soon yielded, and the flame lit that evening in the heart of a young man from Brittany would burn brightly thereafter. But what Bernard didn't know, and which he would fail to realize until it was too late, was that this heiress to a tradition many thousands of years old was, in fact, an heir.
Here's Xi Peipu, an actor or actress of the Peking Opera.
Traditionally, the female roles were played by men. That was because socially, a woman working as an actress had the same status as a prostitute. Any woman performing on stage would be likened to a prostitute. That's why the women were not actresses, and why their parts in the Peking Opera were played by men.
I met Xi Peipu in late 1964 at the home of the chargé d'affaires, Mr. Chaillet. What enticed me was the fact that she didn't dress like other Chinese women, something I found particularly appealing. Her brilliant mind and the fact that she spoke French so fluently. She had studied with the nuns in Kunming in the south of China.
It was rare to find Chinese who spoke French so very well. They did exist, but when they did speak French well, they were invariably working either for the Chinese government or for the French embassy.
I was fascinated because she was cultured in a way that I wasn't. Plus, she was a wonderful storyteller. At the time, I didn't believe them to be legends. It was rather sadistic. She hinted at things. It was incomparable. Every day she had a new story. Shih Pe Pu was like Scheherazade. The real Scheherazade.
Shih Pe Pu was much admired as an opera singer, somebody who had a special aura. The way I remember it, when he turned to look at Bernard Boursicot, he had one face, and when he turned to me, he had another. As though he had both aspects, yin and yang, masculine and feminine, of his personality.
Before I got to China, I had no experience of sex. Shih Pe Pu taught me everything in her own way. It was all smoke and mirrors to me. She came to my place on July 14th, 1965, and we made love for the first time. She produced some blood and moaned in pain. She told me she wasn't like other women, which was true, as Shih Pe Pu, using her special skills, took charge of bringing me to climax. And I think I exceeded her expectations because it worked very well.
It would surely be wrong to ridicule the naivete of a dazzled and smitten 20-year-old youth. In the arms of Shih Pe Pu, Bernard was initiated into the strict rules of centuries-old pleasures. In these stealthy frolics, carried out in darkness, without getting undressed, he felt he was learning the secrets of Oriental love, and to have been deemed worthy of entering this world of complex mysteries.
On December 13th, 1965, I left Shih Pe Pu and China, convinced that she was expecting my child. Guilt-ridden, I called her from Peking Airport to tell her that I would be back. She said she would wait for me.
Barely awakened to the passions of love, Bernard was already at risk of being forced to abandon it. Having made a good impression, the young man was transferred for 3 years to the Middle East. Although a promotion, it felt like a punishment. His heart broken, Boursicot had to reconcile himself to their parting. He packed his bags with the hope of soon being reunited with the woman he now regarded as the love of his life.
When you went to China, you became depersonalized and treated like a child by the Chinese. Then you spontaneously developed an admiration for China, which was perfectly normal. That's what happened to us. You ended up seeing only the good sides. And as the Chinese are skilled in the art of receiving people, you became ambassadors for China when you left the country. China was so closed, so mysterious. The mere fact of going there was something rather wonderful. Plus, the French intelligentsia was very Marxist and saw in the Chinese model everything that the other socialist countries had failed to achieve.
While Bernard moped around the Middle East feeling miserable at the memory of his beloved, China was preparing for the darkest period of its recent history. In 1966, after a 17-year spell in power during which he had sealed off the country, Mao now wanted to attack hearts and minds. Thus began the Cultural Revolution, a misnomer that was an excuse for ideological, cultural, and social cleansing. It would claim almost 1 million victims. Henceforth, the history of China would be spelled out according to the Little Red Book, a collection of quotes from the great helmsman who, at a stroke, expunged thousands of years of tradition. He forced and subjugated every artistic and literary endeavor into the service of revolutionary propaganda, enlisting children into his army of pioneers. Intellectuals and artists were arrested, judged, humiliated, condemned, rehabilitated, and forced to share the fate of the peasants. Mysteriously, Xi Peipu was spared the same fate as his friends. Was he already working for the Chinese secret services? This was the climate of dread and paranoia into which Bernard Boursicot made his return to China. Xi Peipu's enforced silence drove him wild with anxiety.
I left again for Peking, not as a minor accountant this time, but as an archivist in the service of the diplomatic bag. The moment I set foot in Peking, I was consumed by the need to find Xi Peipu, my wife, and our child. As fortune or misfortune would have it, 2 days after my arrival, I tracked down Xi Peipu in the Peking suburbs. I knocked, and I heard them say in Chinese, "Who is it?" The door opened. Xi Peipu said, "Ah, it's you." I asked where our child was, and she produced a photograph of a kid. Just then there was a knock on the door, and it ended up with about 40 people coming into the apartment. Xi Peipu told me to remain calm. After a while, the military police arrived.
The eyes of love are blind, according to a Chinese proverb. It's easy to imagine that the trap now closing around Bernard had been patiently and meticulously prepared from the very first day, the first minute of that first troubling and passionate night. On his return to Peking in 1969, he asked for the son he had never seen. The Chinese secret services had found one for him, a 4-year-old Uyghur orphan, one who could easily pass for a mixed-race child and who had been taught French. But Xi Peipu told him that he lived out of town and that they would be allowed to see him only if Bernard agreed to cooperate.
On my return to China, I was ripe for being taken in, falling into a trap. Xi Peipu had bewitched me.
It was a case of blackmail, and destiny had spoken. Bernard Boursicot would be the spy that China had so meticulously manufactured.
When I first arrived in Peking, I was met at the airport by Bernard Boursicot. I remember very well having a drink with him at the airport. I was impressed because he ordered beer in Chinese, and although I had studied Chinese and taught Chinese, he used a term I was unfamiliar with. So I thought, oh, here's a chap who knows China well. My first outings in Peking were with him, as he took me to little restaurants. And remember, this was a time when foreigners and diplomats were terrified at the idea of going for a stroll in the city in the wake of the Cultural Revolution. And there had been numerous incidents, notably outside the French embassy, which had been surrounded by Red Guards. There was a lingering paranoia, and many people remained confined to their diplomatic quarters, never venturing into Peking, never trying to meet any Chinese to share their way of life. The difficult thing was that the Chinese at that time were not allowed any contact with foreigners. We were pretty much all regarded as spies.
From 1970 onwards, Patrice Favre filmed China on a daily basis and captured some rare footage. Each day, he and his friend Bernard immersed themselves a little more in the reality of life in China, discovering the trials and tribulations of a totalitarian system that locked minds and reduced free will to the worship of a single mindset.
Bernard Boucicault and I often went for walks together with my camera along the back streets. So he was also very often my helper, in inverted commas. He was a bold man. At a time when many people did not dare venture out of the embassy, we were the guys who took risks. Actually, shooting film presented many difficulties in those days. First, there was the curiosity of the Chinese, the eye of the camera. The fact of being a foreigner with a camera drew huge crowds. Plus, we often had to deal with activists who felt that whatever we were filming maybe shouldn't be filmed. So, quite often I would find myself being grilled by a revolutionary committee, writing out an admission of guilt.
Patrice and Bernard gradually began to take part in the local committee meetings, brainwashing sessions during which Revolutionary Guards made sure that the thoughts of Chairman Mao were understood, assimilated, taken on board, and never challenged.
Bernard and I had an expression we used when we went to admit our guilt in the revolutionary committees. We used to say we'd been mass massaged, because it was always to do with the masses and types of behavior that went against the wishes of the masses.
Since the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, Mao had nurtured a fear in people's minds of the threat of attack by the Americans or Soviets. In the French embassy, Bernard Boucicault was now responsible for the diplomatic bag. Although a junior position, it was a highly strategic post for the Chinese, urgently in need of information. The Americans, still fighting in Vietnam and with a presence in South Korea, refused to recognize the communist regime in Peking. Thus, all their documents were conveyed through the French embassy. The trap Bernard found himself in was a veritable godsend for the Chinese secret services, which, thanks to him, had access to thousands of top-secret documents.
Piles of documents arrived every 2 weeks in the diplomatic bag. I sorted them out, then tried to see what would be interesting for China in the political context of the day. The documents concerned American and Russian views on China. I thought, and never thought otherwise, that it would be of interest to the Chinese government.
All of China's internal and external policy issues revolved around two big dangers: American imperialism and the war in Vietnam, and even more importantly, the Soviet Union. In Peking, in the years 1970-1971, tunnels were dug all over the city. The back streets, the hutongs of Peking, were sliced open, and a veritable underground city was created. Every university had its own underground shelter. Preparations were being made for an imminent attack by the Soviet Union. This was the big danger. All the slogans posted in the countryside, urging the people to prepare for famine, prepare for war.
Meanwhile, in the French embassy, Bernard appeared to be just another eager young civil servant. He melted into the background and nobody paid any attention to his comings and goings. Who was to know that the diligent young man who sorted, distributed and archived the mail was one of the Chinese regime's principal sources of information?
To do my duty as an internationalist, I thought I should show them some documents from the French embassy. I always tried to take one on Soviet policy, another on the Sino-Soviet conflict, seen from Moscow, and some dispatches from Washington. Xi Peipu told me never to take more than 3 documents, or they would think it was easy. As I was very highly rated, with 19 out of 20, nobody suspected the presence of a mole in the French embassy, and especially not me. 3 times a week, I went out of the embassy at midday with the documents hidden beneath my parka. I rode my bike a couple of miles to where 3 policemen were waiting with a motorcycle and sidecar. They set off when I rode past. After a while, I realized it was an escort for my protection. My liaison officers arrived to take and photocopy the documents. Xi Peipu would say to me, "You've worked well today." They left very happy. When I left Xi Peipu's, there would be 3 or 4 guys following me on my bike. They would keep me under surveillance until I got close to the embassy. The first time, I was remorseful, upset by my betrayal. But after the second, third, fourth time, it became completely natural.
Bernard Boucicault had an emotional attachment to China. He liked the Chinese adventure. He wasn't there to write books on China or make movies or set up conferences on China. He really soaked up the life there. Of course, at the time, we didn't know what his experience of China was like. But with hindsight, he was enjoying a passionate experience, one that must have been very exciting, since he got to mingle with the Chinese in a way that we didn't. Foreigners were completely cut off from the realities of China and had no contact with the Chinese. He was obviously in his element, and through Xi Peipu he met a lot of Chinese.
Bewitched by a land that simultaneously awakened his sensuality and gave him a family, Comrade Boucicault, agent of the Proletarian Revolution, would soon be rewarded for his services. Delirious with joy at being reunited with Xi Dudu, a loving son who called him Papa, he was soon given permission to roam the country. With Xi Peipu and Xi Dudu, he visited Mao's home province, admired the peaks of Heavenly Pillar and the tombs of the Ming dynasty. Low-key and hard-working within the embassy, he believed himself to have become a highly regarded and respected figure beyond its walls.
I didn't feel that I was betraying France or French interests. I was showing the Chinese how things worked in the world. They were so blinkered with their propaganda that I thought I was doing them a good turn. I was ripe for service, not betrayal. For me, it wasn't a betrayal, it was serving China while proving myself to be a diplomat. Because within the French system, I wasn't very much.
Remember that Boucicault didn't do any of this for money. He was motivated, in a word, by passion.
His behavior couldn't be described as normal. He wasn't the distinguished gentleman of the diplomatic corps. He was rather an odd fish, maybe with personal problems, psychological problems, but he was taking it all in his stride. So it was only natural for him to be among us, but in a rather strange way sometimes.
In the period 1970, 1971, 1972, Shi Pei-pu and I were no longer sleeping together. Every now and then she would perform a sex act on me, but my curiosity wasn't really piqued. I'd always say, "But I want to see," and she'd say, "Don't you believe me?" It was taken as a personal insult. "I suffered a great deal bearing you a son. It wasn't easy, you know."
Was he manipulated? It's hard to say. Did he do it to save and protect Shi Pei-pu, to keep him out of trouble? Maybe that's true anyway, because Boucicault was rather naive, who didn't realize the seriousness of what he was doing. He was something of a scatterbrain, a man who improvised a lot, his very existence even. I don't think he went to China planning to become a spy. Things developed over a period of time as he met people. A lot of it was probably down to chance. I regarded him as unconventional and maladjusted, someone who was outside the diplomatic circle, who didn't really have any friends among the embassy people. Maybe he had some outside, since he often talked about people he'd met, but it was actually very difficult to know who he was. To me, he seemed like a character in a book.
In 1972, when I left China, the Chinese Secret Services offered me a bag full of money. They insisted. I said no. Shi Pei-pu had told me that if I refused everything, I would be a hero. I saw how those who had served the country were treated, and being a hero gave you a completely different status, something beyond the reach of ordinary people.
In 1972, Bernard Boucicault left China a hero, proud of having ensured the safety of his wife and son. During their 6-year separation, they maintained a correspondence, making plans to live together. In 1978, Bernard was posted to Mongolia, where the French embassy had administrative links to the embassy in Peking. Boucicault was assigned the task of transporting the diplomatic bag. Once a month for 4 years, Bernard again handed over the secrets it contained. He was thus able to spend time with his family. Boucicault was then transferred to Belize in Central America. That's when Shi Pei-pu turned up in Paris, accompanied by Shi Dudu on an official cultural exchange program. Her arrival at Charles de Gaulle Airport was filmed by French television because Shi Pei-pu was considered to be a star of the Peking Opera and was very popular in certain French cultural circles. It was a situation that still raises questions today. Were the Chinese secret services trying to re-establish the Boucicault connection? On June 30th, 1983, however, Bernard Boucicault's career as a spy came to an end. Down the years, Commissioner Nart had never suspected a thing. Bernard was diligent, highly regarded, and beyond suspicion.
The Americans, the CIA, informed us in the early 80s about a leak in the French embassy in Peking. There's a great deal of rivalry between secret services. But as their telegrams were also compromised, they were keen for him to be stopped. We investigated. Unfortunately, in the interim, Bernard Boursicot had been transferred to Belize. We had no intention of surrendering the element of surprise by notifying the Foreign Ministry and having him repatriated for cross-examination. We wanted him to come back of his own accord, that's to say, when he was on leave, to interview him. The arrest was rather difficult because it took 2 attempts. The first time he wasn't there. He was away from home. But the policeman who intervened noted the presence of a Chinese in his home. We went back a while later.
3 guys grabbed me from behind, yelling, "Police, police, police!" They said, "We need to ask you a few questions." I told them I was a diplomat and that they couldn't arrest me. I tried to hang on to a tree. And then they handcuffed me.
He was cross-examined and taken to Rue d'Argenson, which was counterintelligence HQ at that time.
They were well informed. Commissioner Nart said they wanted to know what I'd been up to in China between 1969 and 1972.
From his statement, we realized the trap he'd fallen into, looking into the relationships he was able to have with Chinese citizens. At that time, it was strictly forbidden for any Chinese to have any kind of relations with a Westerner. So we had a problem. He explained that he was having intimate relations with a woman named Shi Peipu, and that this relationship, according to Boursicot, had yielded a son, a boy by the name of Shi Dudu.
He walked around me with a plastic file which contained a photograph of Shi Dudu, among others. That's when I cracked, as they say.
Since I was in charge of the whole case, I questioned Shi Peipu. And quite frankly, I was confronted with someone who presented all the characteristics of a woman: no beard, slender hands, etc. At that time, it never occurred to me that all Peking opera parts were played by men, including the female ones. As far as I was concerned, I was interviewing a woman.
When I discovered that Bernard Boursicot was spy number 1, public enemy number 1, and had been arrested, like everyone else, I found out via the French press. His activities, as reported in the newspapers, seemed to me at the time to be both exaggerated and rather hard to believe. We discussed it among ourselves. Was it the Foreign Ministry or the security services being mischievous? Obviously, it was a very murky business, until things finally started to become clear.
A few weeks later, when we had referred this group of protagonists to the law courts, the magistrate called me and announced in a sarcastic tone, "Mr. Nart, I have had Shi Peipu examined, and I can tell you that he is most definitely not a woman." The way he put it was, he has a pair of swingers. To clear the matter up, he had to call upon a doctor. which Shi Peipu had vehemently resisted, biting the doctor, who beat a hasty retreat. It took several officers to subdue him. His genitals were examined, and his sex established as being most definitely male.
On my third evening in prison, I heard on the radio that the Chinese Mata Hari was a man. I said, she can't be. I was high up on the third row of bunks in prison, and I fell twice during the night. 8 months later, we met with the magistrate. I said to him, but why didn't you tell me? And he answered splendidly, we didn't have time. I asked him if I could see it, and he dropped his trousers. When I had proof and saw that Shi Peipu was definitely a man and had been deceiving me all along, and that as a result Shi Peipu could not be the mother of Shi Dudu, I wanted to end my life. I made an attempt at suicide with a razor blade, but it wasn't enough to finish me off. Afterwards, I lived like a zombie for months. Plus, I was in prison. I didn't trust anybody anymore. Neither myself or anyone else.
The Frenchman and the Chinese who spied for China, and among whose rather strange love affair, came as a surprise to magistrates.
The verdict came in less than an hour ago, the culmination of an extravagant espionage trial that began yesterday in a special court in Paris. The Chinese artist and the attaché from the French embassy in Peking, accused of handing over official secrets to China, were both condemned to 6 years imprisonment.
The two defendants took part in an operation on behalf of the Chinese secret services. Shi Peipu, an intellectual and an artist, used his considerable acting talents to entice Bernard Boucicaut. The naive and ingenuous French civil servant thus betrayed his country, handing over numerous documents to the Chinese authorities.
For me, it was shameful that Shi Peipu was not a woman, and that I allowed myself to be deceived in that way.
Had I been a member of the jury, and I told him so, I would have found him guilty, because without a shadow of a doubt, according to the penal code, he handed information over to a foreign power and thus had to be convicted.
I didn't regard it as an act of betrayal at all. I felt I was serving both countries, and I still don't understand why sharing political opinions with the Chinese was in any way a betrayal of France.
Ordinary spy, extraordinary spy, it's difficult to say. A spy becomes extraordinary when he provides extraordinary information and documents. But the man himself was very ordinary. But ordinary figures are very often behind major affairs.
A player cast aside by an immense drama whose intrigue baffled him, Bernard Boucicaut served his sentence first in Fresnes, then in a remand center in Melun. Within the 4 walls of his cell, stricken with shame and regret, he finally came to understand the perversion of Shi Peipu, with whom right till the end he believed he shared the most intimate secrets. The bitterness intensified for Bernard with the early release of Shi Peipu. In April 1987, under pressure from Peking, he was pardoned by François Mitterrand less than a year after his conviction.
Shi Peipu was released because of pressure from the Chinese, who signed lucrative contracts with France. Politics overrides justice in such cases.
For Bernard, the ultimate affront was still to come. Contrary to regulations which state that any individual arrested and jailed as a spy must subsequently be deported, Shi Peipu was allowed to stay in Paris undisturbed.
You're playing a man with a beard, so forget that you are a woman. Because of the beard, you must open your mouth wider.
He survived with Shi Dudu on a meager pension from the Chinese embassy and his income from singing lessons. He exercised his seductive talents on sinophiles, artists, and members of the Chinese diaspora.
It's a Machiavellian tale, dreamed up by somebody very wicked. Since he's now dead, it can be said. I was Xi Peipu's plaything. For him, a frustrated actor, his life was a kind of show, especially his life with me. Looking back, I must be the biggest stooge of the century. And all things considered, that's nothing to be proud of.
On his release from prison, Bernard Boursicot surely wanted to disappear, to slip into gentle anonymity. But his story had outgrown him.
Your story inspired first a play produced on Broadway in 1988, which has toured around 30 countries, although not France, unfortunately. Then there's a David Cronenberg film, which will be released in France under the title M. Butterfly, with Jeremy Irons, a major star, playing you, and John Lone, the man who will play the singer. How can that be?
It's true that if someone told me this tale, I'd have trouble believing it.
And yet it happened to you.
Yes.
Is it that this woman...
Because I followed my passion. I was fascinated. I was in love.
He made you spy for China, you both received jail terms, and he duped your sexuality.
Ah, that's even more painful, of course.
That's understandable.
It was a beautiful film, full of poetry. Xi Peipu was portrayed rather truthfully, a little less perverse than the real one.
He was in a state of great mental confusion, identifying after the event with the heroes of Cronenberg's movie and the Broadway play. So his image became multiplied, like in a set of mirrors, and I don't think he knew who he was anymore.
As a result, Bernard Boursicot is no longer master of his own destiny. He has inspired David Cronenberg, Broadway, and Hollywood, not to mention painters such as Liu Feng, a rising star of modern Chinese art.
This series goes to the heart of the crisis. In this figure, menace and crisis are omnipresent. I painted this picture after I met Bernard. The new look I bring to the Chinese culture and landscape is inspired by Bernard. On this picture, the man is oppressed by an outside threat. This creates an inexplicable and inescapable tension.
Despite his suffering and humiliation, Bernard Boursicot's deep love for China never wavered. He returned there often until, in 2008, he suffered a serious stroke.
He came back to China now and again with a hankering to be acknowledged by the Chinese. In fact, I think that being disliked is something of an issue for Boursicot. So he yearns for recognition, he needs friendship, he needs sincere people who recognize him for what he is. Whereas he's always been somewhat sidelined and marginalized by others.
I get the feeling that Bernard still lives in the past. I told him to forget the past and to look to the future. When he is urged to look after himself, he just goes, ah, ah, ah. It goes in one ear and straight out the other.
After so many lies, perhaps this becomes so thick you can't even blush, as the Chinese say.
Today, heartbroken, Bernard Boursicot struggles to live with the burden of his sorrow. Bernard lost everything: the cherished son he believed to be his, the woman who, although a man, he was madly in love with, and his health, now fragile, which forbids him from traveling. Shame and regret, those gloomy gatecrashers in the feast of memories, can never mask the burden of a love stolen.
Free man, you will always cherish the sea, said Baudelaire. Hail, ancient ocean, said de Lautréamont. The sea for me is synonymous with freedom. I hope it one day carries me back to China, where I wish to end my life. I miss China.